Think for yourself. Question authority. Think with your friends. Create new realities.
What's up, y'all? If you're here, you've made it down the YouTube rabbit hole. You've reached the psychedelic corner of the internet. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about this super fascinating book that Tim Leary wrote in jail. It's called Exo Psychology, a manual on the use of the human nervous system according to the instructions of the manufacturers. Hey y'all, welcome back to the channel. If you're new, my name is Tyler. I'm a musician and psychonaut based in Houston, Texas, and this channel is all about the psychedelic experience, the contents of these amazing experiences, their meaning. We talk about creativity and anything that I find interesting in the psychedelic world. So if that sounds up your alley, please subscribe to the channel. So today we're discussing this super fascinating book, Exo Psychology. Tim Leary wrote this book while he was in jail in 1976, and the result is a radical set of ideas about the human nervous system and the evolution of humanity. A lot of interesting books were written by people who were in jail behind bars. The first example that comes to my mind being the Book of Revelations in the Bible. Was written by someone who was imprisoned at the time of the Roman Empire. Tim Leary was despised by President Nixon for his staunch advocacy of using psychedelics to open your mind. As a leader of the 1960s counterculture movement, President Nixon considered Tim Leary his political enemy. So in 1970, he was sent to jail for a tiny amount of marijuana. And I think at first he was sentenced to something like 30 years, and then they got pushed down to 10 years. He escaped jail in 1970, and after various escapades around Africa and Europe, he was eventually caught in Afghanistan and brought back to the US and served more jail time until 1976, which is the time period which he wrote this book. So I just want to give you a little bit of background about Tim Leary just before we go into this. I'm sure a lot of you psychedelic heads know about Tim Leary, but there's just a few things that I want to highlight. In the 60s, Tim Leary was quoted as saying, "We saw ourselves as anthropologists from the 21st century inhabiting a time module set somewhere in the dark ages of the 1960s. So that quote is something important to keep in mind for the perspective of this book. It kind of comes from this futuristic perspective looking back. So I thought I would include that quote there. And it's interesting to hear what he thought about his role in the 60s. When dealing with Tim Leary, you always have to take things with a grain of salt. He's a storyteller, and storytellers tend to exaggerate and sometimes inflate the truth a little bit. But with all of that said, reading Tim Leary, you can guarantee at least 30% or so of what he's saying has some real validity to it, and he said himself that he doesn't have philosophical answers, but he raises the questions. Another reason Tim Leary is an important person in the present moment is that he was the originator of the quote, "Find the others," which was then quoted again by Terence McKenna, and that is the name of this channel. So without Tim Leary, this channel wouldn't exist, or at least not with his name. Tim Leary often doesn't present evidence for his ideas, but they always have this whimsical charm to them, and that's something that I've always been attracted to as far as people in the psychedelic world like Terence McKenna, Tim Leary, Eric Davis, that carry on this tradition of the Irish bard, the psychedelic storyteller. That's one of the things that I love about Tim Leary so much, is this singing, lyrical kind of Irish quality to it. Like even the subtext on the title of this book, "A Manual on the Use of the Human Nervous System According to the Instructions of the Manufacturers." Like, it's already just so witty, and I love it. Like, as soon as I read that, I was like, man, I love this already. Okay, so where to start, man? This book is quite a doozy. So I guess the main premise of the book, he's saying we're about to migrate into space. And basically that we need to get smart fast because we are preparing to enter this new phase in our evolution where we will be migrating off of the planet, which he compares to like an embryo or a nest, and that this is our future. So I'll read you a little quote of how Tim Leary summed it up. He said, "Exopsychology views human destiny in terms of an evolving nervous system designed by DNA intelligence, which uses planets as temporary embryonic nesting sites in an interstellar migratory process destined to extend lifespan and life scope to become symbiotic transceivers of astrophysical intelligence." Wow, so that's already a lot. So let me just scoot back a little bit where he says, in terms of an evolving nervous system designed by a DNA intelligence. So what he's saying is that one of the main other parts of this book is that he is presenting this idea of circuits. He's saying that the human nervous system has circuits within it, and this is a borrowed idea and upgraded from the idea of the chakra system, the Hindu chakra system. So if you've heard about Kundalini and chakras and things like that, that's what he's talking about when he mentions circuits, but it's kind of this westernized, updated version. And there's been a lot of people who have contributed to these ideas and upgraded them after Leary, like Robert Anton Wilson. He was one of the first to kind of westernize this idea of the chakras. And he says, to become symbiotic transceivers of astrophysical intelligence. So what he means by that is that the higher we evolved, the more we're able to tune in to these other forms of consciousness and communicate with extraterrestrials, and maybe even some knowledge that's embedded into the quantum field of the universe or something like that, where we can tap into the wisdom of nature on a cosmic level. When you're hearing stuff like this, you got to keep in mind this is a man who took heroic doses of LSD like once a week. So he was diving so deep into his consciousness that he was seeing things on a cellular level, and he was connecting with his ancestry, which I have a similar experience when I took mushrooms. And he's just talking about all of these things, and he's saying that in our minds and our neurons that we can sense somehow that we're about to move out into space. And this is something that I totally subscribe to as well. I feel like there's this unconscious urge that we have to leave this planet. I don't know what it is, but I feel some of us are tuned into it, and we can feel that we're about to leave this place. At least some of us are. It reminds me of the Terence McKenna quote where he said that the mushroom told him, "This is what it's like when a species prepares to depart for the stars, that stuff gets crazy. It's a fire in a madhouse, and this is all part of our evolution and our journey to leave the home planet." He says that this is the priority of our time, to be able to figure out how to migrate off of the planet and to continue evolving. And he points out that there are a lot of people who complain about the problems we have here on Earth, who say, well, we need to focus on these terrestrial problems before we spend all of our time and resources going to space. There's the unequal distribution of wealth, there's famine, there's war, there's violence, there's abuse. All of these things are serious problems, but what Tim Leary is saying is that he says however sincere and well-intentioned these complaints are, that they're wrong, because our problem is not a material or money problem. It's a political, a psychological, and a philosophical problem, that we don't have the will to fix these problems. It's not that we can't and that we only have limited money, so let's spend it here as opposed to there. It's just the willpower that we have. He says, our problems are not material, but political, psychological, spiritual. Tim suggests it is navigational, that humans have lost their map and compass. And he says the only way out from down is up. He made a comparison to World War II, that when World War II came around, we got smart fast because we were backed into a corner. You know, all the scientists had to develop weapons and Everyone had to get smart and using technology out of necessity at that time. He's suggesting that we're in a similar boat now where we need to really get our act together so that we can pull off this process. So one of the ideas he suggests is that humans are kind of like biological robots, and we're acting on these circuits. He suggests that all of these circuits and things are developed by specific times in our childhood where we're sensitive, where we latch on to something, and that becomes our idea of the circuit. So he said humans who move to space will rapidly mutate just like the amphibians that left the land. Because exopsychology is the idea of seeing the human nervous system and evolution and DNA from the outside perspective of ourselves in the future, from the vantage point of our future evolved spacefaring selves. He mentions that our DNA could have the blueprint already, similar to how a caterpillar already in its DNA has everything it needs to go into a cocoon and eventually to metamorphosis and turning into a butterfly. So he's suggesting the same thing is already within us humans, and that this butterfly is this being that is evolved to live in zero gravity and outer space. And he mentions this idea of that during human development we kind of go through the phases of evolution. Like whenever you're a fetus, you're almost like this little tadpole creature. As your fetus grows, you kind of go up the chain of evolution, and then eventually you're born as a mammal. He uses specific examples like this. He says, the baby imprints an invertebrate reality, the crawling child a mammalian reality, the preschooler a Paleolithic Stone Age reality, and then the domesticated reality, which is where we're at right now. And he makes the argument that the reason he's being jailed and suppressed is because his ideas are radical, and it's a backlash response from the part of humanity that does not like this, similar to the ideas of Socrates, Bruno, all these people who were executed and burned at the stake for their revolutionary ideas. So Tim Leary suggests life was seeded on this womb planet in the form of amino acid templates designed to be activated by solar radiation and to unfold in a series of genetic molts and metamorphoses. Each life form on this planet is an alien immigrant from outer space. We are all unidentified flying organisms. Love it. UFO. So he says right now that humanity is transitioning from the fourth circuit, which we would call the heart chakra, and transitioning up into the fifth circuit, or the fifth chakra. So that would be transitioning from the heart chakra to the throat chakra as a whole, as a species. He says, the transition from fourth to fifth circuit is complicated because it has been viewed as antisocial, the perils of hedonism, the socially dangerous discovery of the rapture circuit. My natural bodily sensations are more pleasurable and more interesting than territorial social rewards. I want to stay loose and high. Mundane affairs are robot. Have you ever noticed that people who get into psychedelics and smoke weed or anything like that, they come to view the rest of society as somewhat robotic, and I think there is validity to that. So he's attributing this change in perspective to this change in circuits, and what he calls the fifth circuit is the rapture circuit. So you think of when you're feeling amazing on psychedelics or enjoying the pleasures of life, hedonism, that kind of thing has been suppressed, and he's suggesting that this is the next step. He says that hedonism is actually an advancement in our evolution because dialing and tuning into your own nervous system are the first step away from robothood and toward controlling our own nervous system. Hedonism is seen as this transition phase, not the end state, but a transition towards our future lives in space. This is interesting because he's kind of commenting on the 1960s as the jump where this transition starts to happen. He says, activation of the fifth circuit marks the infancy of interstellar existence. Hippies and Zen adepts are grounded butterflies, neurologically ready, but technologically unprepared for flight. Musicians, poets, artists, and aesthetes have been exponents of this type of consciousness in sensory-enhancing drugs because the Fifth Circuit defines the aesthetic level of reality. However, beauty and rapture are not evolutionary ends in themselves, but anticipatory preparations on the parts of a neurogenetically evolving species for extraplanetary existence. He says the aim of life is SMILE, and this is an acronym. It's SMI squared LE, and that stands for Space Migration, Intelligence Increase, Life Extension. So it's a catchy little acronym for our future as humanity. So Tim Leary suggests that we can consciously decipher our DNA and our RNA, and that way we can look back into the past, going billions of years in our evolution. And I think this kind of idea comes from deep psychedelic trips, like a deep LSD trip, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had an experience of feeling contiguous with all of evolution, and you feel how you go back millions and millions of years, billions of years. And I think that this is where that idea comes from, and he's trying to wrap these ideas up in a theory or a hypothesis. And this is commonly reported for other people as well. Let me know if you've ever had an experience of seeing back in time, or your evolution, or your ancestors, or anything like that. So he breaks down each of these 8 circuits total into 3 stages each. So he breaks down our total evolution into 24 stages. He says that the first 4 circuits, or first 4 chakras, are terrestrial. So you can think of that as earth-based. And that moving up from there, the top 4 circuits are extraterrestrial, or they are for when we're going to be living in space. So this is something interesting that I came across in the book. He hypothesizes that systematic seasonal variations in solar radiation create alterations in DNA templating at the time of conception, which determine human neurogenetic types, in that the 12 zodiac signs may crudely personalize 12 species very different in neurological wiring, which reflect and recapitulate 12 stages of human evolution. Each zodiac species thus represents the mastery of one of the 12 neurological stages which are involved in the evolution of life on our planet, preparatory for extraterrestrial migration. He says that each zodiac type carries out a specialized survival task comparable to worker, queen, scout, etc. So, in my personal view, astrology can be very superstitious, but I can't lie to you when I've read some things that line up perfectly with me, and it is actually very specific in terms of my personality or my temperament and things like that. So, although I'm a little bit skeptical about astrology, I have also come up with ideas about this kind of similar to this, where I thought maybe the seasons, when let's say you're 90 days old and it's winter, that might have a different imprint on you than if you were born in the summer, or the other way around. So I think that it's possible that the zodiac has some validity that we don't actually understand. So I'm not ruling that out, and his idea of connecting the zodiacs to these different levels of our evolution is pretty interesting. He talks about the idea of island realities, or reality tunnels, where every being sees things and experiences things different than us. Like if you compare the way that we see to the way that a snake sees. A snake, when it sees a mouse, doesn't see a furry little creature, it sees heat. And he uses that to make the point that if an animal can have such a different view of reality than us, then so can we as humans have different views of reality just within our own species. Just as a little side note, I thought it was interesting that he uses gender-neutral pronouns when he's talking about these future versions of humanity. He calls it she, but it's spelled capital S, capital H-E, just putting she and he together, and then here, as in like his or her, HIR as the possessive gender neutral pronoun. So I thought that was interesting because someone in the 70s using gender neutral pronouns and being like, this is the future. It's like encouraging including all of humanity when we talk about things, because especially back in the past, you always hear mankind or like the fall of man. It's always focused on the male angle of the world and our existence. So I just think this is interesting and kind of forward looking for the time. So he talks about reconditioning yourself using psychedelics, using LSD, and that he mentions some people complain that they're having the same trip over and over and over again. And he makes the point that you need to expose yourself to different stimuli to get more out of it. Being in the same environment, having the same ego, having the same people around you. On the flip side, he talks about a psychologist couple that flew around the world going to spiritual centers, one of them being Kyoto, Japan. He said they studied a week about Japanese spirituality and myths, and that after a week of time, they dropped some acid and went to the most holy site in Japan, a temple in Kyoto, and they were on LSD and they absorbed the vibes there and absorbed the myths and the spirituality, and that this is how you can re-imprint yourself instead of bringing your own worldview just somewhere else. So it's really interesting how Tim Leary referred to this. I'm going to read a little bit of quote of this example of going to Japan. He said, "For 6 hours they absorbed the signals of that place and became neurologically Japanesed." It's a very interesting way to put it, but I kind of see what he's getting at. So in talking about the 1960s, Tim Leary said, the 60s saw a general raising of consciousness. He called it a widespread retraction of larval imprints. So when he says larval, he's talking about people who are not ready to leave Earth. And when he's talking about imprints, he's talking about these circuits, these robotic circuits that we're operating on. And he talks about what replaced that when we reject the old robothood, what replaced that? And he makes the point that he doesn't think that these new realities were thoughtfully selected. He said, while there is a dropout away from the parent culture and joyful hedonic acceptance of rapture and direct experience, there is an unfortunate tendency to reject technology and scientific thinking. The drug culture of the 60s wandered around spaced out. He wrote, this is a good term, spaced out. High, but with no place to go. One generation too early for interstellar migration. He said, the question of the 60s was, after retracting imprints from the material culture, where did you go? The answers of the past were back to Jesus, back to India, the here and now of transcendental masturbation. The consciousness fads became soothing terrestrial turn-offs, offering peace of mind, detached serenity, health foodism, feel-good sensory supermarkets for premature mutants who have no idea where to go. So he's talking about all of the little sections of spirituality and New Age mysticism and a lot of that corny, cheesy stuff that, doesn't have very much depth to it. It's just kind of a fad that people start taking on because they've rejected their old culture and they're looking for something new. So he's just talking about all of these things that came in the wake of raising consciousness in the 60s, how there weren't really a lot of good options when it came to spirituality. He said, the hedonic spirit of the 60s was a manifestation of stage 13, the first stage of the 6th circuit, which is the third eye chakra. Exploratory use of a new circuit. It is natural that the first post-larval generation would appear confused, disoriented, frivolous, irritatingly vague. The task of the next generation is to learn how to transmit the new experiences, to raise intelligence, to create extraterrestrial models based on scientific evidence. He also goes on to compare the hippie and the yogi, to the stages of development that he's talking about. He calls them transitional stages of wingless butterflies. Yeah, the 13th level, he says, is the hippie, and the 14th is the yogi. He calls them wingless butterflies that are evolved beyond terrestrial attachments. He says the 15th stage is tantric. So tantric as in like tantric sex and people who work with the energies of kundalini, and especially in the context of sex. That's what he means by tantric. He says that it's understandable that people who have activated the Fifth Circuit react negatively against materialism, the scientism that produces plastic consumerism, military industrialism, and polluted overpopulation. But the rejection of scientific inquiry becomes a smug know-nothingness. I'm going to read a couple of quotes from the book to close this out. He said, "The evidence from astronomy, biochemistry, genetics, nuclear physics defines the true frontier of philosophy and religion. Scientific American is more far out than any occult magazine, the periodic table of elements more prophetic than the tarot deck. The nucleus of the atom is a realm more mysterious and omniscient than any theological fantasy. The cosmology of an expanding universe riddled with black holes more bizarre than the eschatology of Dante, Homer, and Ramayana. Despite this noble rejection of the artificial, the hippie yogi tantric establishment is an entrenched, self-indulgent block to evolution, a transitional stage preparatory to planetary migration." So yeah, he's basically saying that you don't need anything extra. Like, the universe we live in is already psychedelic as it is. We don't need to add anything that is wishy-washy or wishful thinking, things that don't have any basis in reality. And like, I say that with a grain of salt too, because I believe that reality is stranger than we think, and we should go and investigate these strange areas of reality, but we should also come to it with a scientific mindset to really kind of parse out what is true and what is only speculation or only our imagination. So towards the end here, he says, "It's possible that we've already, in this introduction, transmitted more extraterrestrial information than is contained in all of the books which has previously been written." Then he closes it out with this quote from Don Juan, Tales of Power. The quote says, "But maybe I'm revealing things I shouldn't, Don Juan. It doesn't matter what one reveals or what one keeps in oneself," he said. "Everything we do, everything we are, rests on our personal power. If we have enough of it, one word uttered to us might be sufficient to change the course of our lives. But if we don't have enough personal power, the most magnificent piece of wisdom can be revealed to us, and that revelation won't make a damn bit of difference." So all in all, this book has been a wild ride. It's a little dense and kind of tough to get through at some points, but there's always these little whimsical flashes of just brilliance and possibly interesting ideas that we should look into. I love this book. It was one of the first things I read after I had my Kundalini experience, of anybody talking about chakras or circuits or anything like that. So this was an important book for me on my psychedelic journey, and I would definitely recommend it to any of y'all if you're interested. It's just a really wild and cool and interesting book, and you just think of it as a piece of history, and what a strange character and world this must be for a book to come out like this. And I think in general, the idea that we are meant to migrate to space, I believe is true. And he talks about this idea of like the type of spacey consciousness that you sometimes have on psychedelics, cosmic consciousness, or even on weed. Sometimes things could feel very spacey. That's why they call it spaced out. And he's making the argument that the reason that things get spacey is because that is our higher level of evolution, and that's what we're ultimately going to turn into when the human species turns into fully grown butterflies. That will be what it is. We're going to be spacefaring beings. So I think that there's really some truth to that, and it'll be really interesting to go back and read this book in 200 years when we are a spacefaring civilization and see how it goes and see how many things he was right about and how many things he was wildly incorrect about. So with all of that said, check out the book. This is going to be my first part of a series. I'm thinking about calling it Psychedelic Book Club right now, where I'll read all of my most interesting psychedelic books. So I'll be adding more books and videos about them over time. So with all that said, thanks for watching the video. I'm going to leave you with this little video of Tim Leary talking at an event with Terence McKenna in the 90s. So I'll leave you with that clip. So thanks for listening. Hope y'all enjoyed it, and peace.
It's a rare and wonderful moment in the history of someone who has been a light carrier or a message sender on this long path. Terence said before we got on stage today that basically we are sending out ideas. We call them memes. We're sending out contagious ideas. We're sending out infectious ideas that will hopefully land in fertile minds and brains and a good idea at the right time suddenly start growing in your mind. So we're part of the longest tradition of human spirit, the belief in individuality. Fuck society.
Yes, I.
You got to stand up and say to every God out there, fuck you, God.
Yes, I.